I've broken down some different barriers that can be faced by the autism community and autistic individuals. And we're thinking beyond the diagnostic criteria, underdiagnosis. This is a pretty big thing. So there's a lot of people who do not have an autism diagnosis, or they could be self-diagnosed. And so therefore, they're not going to be receiving accommodations right through the university. So I want us to think today about how underdiagnosis creates a barrier and what we can do to try to overcome those barriers when we're here. There are also a lot of unwritten rules. There are a lot of unwritten rules for college. There are a lot of unwritten rules for employment. There are a lot of unwritten rules just for your day-to-day activities. And what I mean by that is there are certain expectations of us when we walk into different environments, and nobody actually tells us what those expectations are. They just hope that we learned it in our interactions so far. And so sometimes we're expecting autistic individuals, autistic students to know something, even though we never told them. Autism stereotypes and implications. We are getting more options, right, as far as media presence, but still not a whole lot of options out there to really help us understand. The other thing that happens with autism stereotypes or implications is our thought on intellect, capabilities, and empathy. Really, empathy is like a really big one, where a lot of people believe or maybe have been told that autistic people cannot display empathy. So sometimes if a person shares that they're autistic, they may feel like you might automatically think of Rain Man or the Good Doctor, and you may think that they hold a certain level of intelligence or whatever it may be. Visible versus hidden. There's lots of disabilities that are visible, okay, and there are some movements maybe with an autistic person's body that you may feel is something that's visible. But there's also a lot of things that people are hiding, and that's called masking. And masking can have a lot of mental health implications. And so it's important for us to understand that we may see a person trying to fit in, but what's really happening is that they're masking their natural socialization, their natural way they socialize. And because of that, they are starting to experience burnout or different mental health. Intersectionality, there's a lot in intersectionality as there is with really every population, but anytime you combine disability with other things on this list, then it can create more barriers. Previous educational experiences, as in, was high school a good experience for you? Was high school a bad experience for you? Did you start out at a community college before you came here? Was that a good experience? Was it a bad experience? Those can also lead to some thoughts before a person starts in class. I've outlined some different ways that these areas can possibly impact learning. All right, so underdiagnosis, we did talk about this a little bit. So may never have received accommodations, right, if they have not been diagnosed. They could have been misdiagnosed. That's very common. For women, there could actually be a really large population of women out there, and we just don't know because oftentimes they are diagnosed much later in life, and they still have a lot of underdiagnosis. And if we think about how we understand ourselves and how we understand how we learn, if we have a diagnosis that can help us to understand ourselves better, that can have a positive impact on our learning. So when we don't have that diagnosis yet, that can negatively impact our learning. And there's more self-diagnosis happening right now because it is actually very difficult to get a diagnosis, especially once you're an adult. Sometimes you might have to pay $2,000 to get a diagnosis. And is that reasonable for everyone? Likely not. There's some other things that I've heard is that someone could not increase their life insurance policy because they had a diagnosis. Okay, so there's also some other implications that go really beyond what we might automatically think of as far as diagnosis goes, and it is a gray area. Unwritten rules for college. So it's been a while since I've been in college, so I did ask some people what some unwritten rules for college might be. You guys also, I'm sure, have your own thoughts on what unwritten rules for college are. But I've outlined a few here, how to navigate friendships, how to navigate creating your own community. I think the one great thing about being on a college campus is you really can find your community. There's like all different types of people that come together on a college campus. And so you might, maybe in your high school, especially if it was a small high school, you might have never found your community. But you could have that opportunity to find that community here. But do you know how to do it? Maybe rules for communicating with professors or different staff, college staff. And also how do you manage time? How do you manage assignments? That's something that can be challenging for any new student. But if a student also has some difficulties with executive functioning skills, that might create more of a challenge. Autism implications and stereotypes, potentially feeling defeat before you walk into the door, walk through the door, walk to the classroom. Someone might be afraid to show them their true selves because maybe there isn't a stereotype that they feel represents them. Others challenging their intellect, capabilities, empathy, right? You disclose and automatically someone goes in and, thinks that you need, a specific accommodation because that might be what works for another student, and that's not always the case. Visible versus hidden. Suicide is a really big issue in the autism community. It's the second leading cause of death. So it's very significant. Burnout is also something that's experienced a lot, especially in a college environment. So it's really important to consider how what you can see, what you don't see impacts someone's mental health. Intersectionality does create other priorities, lacking of access to proper resources. The autism community does have a very large prevalence, like 6 times, 5 to 8 is the technical number. Some people say 6 times more likely to be transgender or gender non-conforming. And so I think we all know what that implication means, right? So if we have someone who's gender non-conforming, that might be very important to them right now, right? And it might not be as important as something else that we may think is important. As far as educational experiences go, about 50% of autistic individuals have reported bullying. That's a pretty big number. Just overall, people report not fitting in, not feeling like they're good enough in school, but also being labeled as a difficult student, okay? Because sometimes the autistic adult that we see in front of us look very different as an autistic child. And the experiences they had as a child could have been very negative in the classroom because maybe their behaviors were seen as very different than the general classroom. I've worked with a number of adults whose parents knew their diagnosis when they were a very young child and never told them. And then when they became an adult and their diagnosis was shared with them, obviously there's a lot of things that come into play here. If our family knew something about us for 15 years and we never knew that, that can have a lot of implications beyond just our ability to understand accommodations available. So we have a lot of different cultural backgrounds that exist within autism. At one point, we said that it was equal across all race and ethnicities, but we're finding now with the research that's not really the case. So Asian Pacific Islander, that's kind of a little bit higher, and then Hispanic, Black, and then white or Caucasian individuals. And so that's what we're seeing, although that is more recent, I think as of the last year, that's when I started to see that information. So I'm just curious to see what comes from there. Do we all know the number of 1 in 36? Are we aware of that? Oh, I apologize for not putting that in here. So the current number of rate of autism in children is 1 in every 36 children or child, however we might say that. It is different in each state. California is 1 in 22, which I find interesting. And other states are 1 in 44, so that's kind of our average. Michigan is not in that state rate. Presentation for autism. Autism looks very different for each person. So something that we always like to say is that you know one autistic person, you know one autistic person. And that's not always the case with all disabilities. Some disabilities have a lot of commonalities, and that's not the case for autism. While there may be, of course there's a commonality that resulted in diagnosis, right, or discovery of autism, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the presentation is going to be the same for each person. So some people may crave sensory input, right, with their bodies, and they show that craving. Other people may completely avoid sensory input. So it really can be different with each person, and it can be a very hidden disability. Socioeconomic status. It is also said that autism impacts all SES communities equally, although now that we see the differences in racial and ethnic diagnosis, maybe there might be some changes in the future. I don't know, we'll see. Gender identity, I did share that there are some differences among gender identity for the autism community. It is, right now, the number is still 4 times more likely, and boys are men than women or girls. But that may change as we're starting to increase our diagnosis, and I think having more awareness of what it looks like in females, which you may see as helping with our, women only program, right? Although it's not, we don't have nearly as much enrollment as in that program as we do in other programs, because there's just not as much of the community. Intellectual ability does vary, and I'll kind of combine intellectual ability and communication styles here, because sometimes people may hold a certain thought that because a person might be non-speaking, they might not communicate verbally, that automatically implies a certain intellectual ability, and that's not the case. Okay, so we want to make sure that we're not jumping to conclusions on someone's intellectual ability just because of their communication style. We do have 30%, I believe, of the autism community is also diagnosed with an intellectual disability. So there is a prevalence of intellectual disability in the community. I also want to say with communication styles, we hear, does anybody hear about lack of eye contact? Like these things are like negative things, right? That's kind of a stereotype that comes with autism as communication styles. But I think it's really important to know that if a person is actively trying to fit in and match other people's communication styles in a classroom, that they are likely masking, right? And that they could be so focused on making sure that they're doing what is kind of stereotypically acceptable, that they're actually not learning any of the information, or they could not be learning any of the information that you're presenting to them. So I always like to say to let go of any stereotypical expectations for communication. And really to think about what is required for communication. Do we have to say it out loud? No, because there's a ton of ways for us to say something without verbalizing, right? And even do I have to direct my body towards you to communicate with you? No, I don't. I can turn around. If you're deaf, that's probably going to be a bad thing, right? I may have to go and place myself back in front of you. But aside from that, I can't really think of a reason why it would be bad. I say that I am deaf in one ear, so I have to look at people when I speak to them, which is why I tend to put myself in front of people when I'm speaking to them. But it's just important to remember important to think about what is your requirement for communication? And is that a fair requirement, or can the information be shared in another way? I want to talk just a little bit about outcomes, okay? Because they're not so great, right? So if we think about maybe one of the purposes for going to a university would be to get a good job, right? A good paying job. So the autism community, 36% attend post-secondary education compared to 75% of young adults. 40% have received some sort of help in college of autistic students. Employment rate is 58% employed, lowest of any disability category. VR user or vocational rehabilitation user. So this might be also a specific sample size here, so that should be noted. But the report is 23 hours of work weekly for an average of $8 an hour. And that's really horrendous, right? So this is not a good outcome. So even though we may have a student that graduates, what are their employment options after? 19% of autistic individuals live independently as young adults. Similar disability groups can be 60 to 80%. That's a significant number. And also 1 in 4 autistic adults are socially isolated, meaning they do not have a community that they're regularly in touch with.
What does VR stand for again?
Vocational rehabilitation. Sorry, I should not have put VR in there. I apologize. I looked for quite a while to find what is the actual rate of graduation for the autism community. The number that I found was 17%, but it was so challenging for me to find that I don't really want to say that's like an actual statistic. I mean, it does exist, it did exist in research, but I don't know how valid that is. And I don't know if there's been enough research done on this, or at least not that I could find. I'm sure there are many people who are way more skilled at locating information than I am, right? But that's something to keep in mind, is it could have a very low rate of graduation. Also in the 58% employed, 30% of that number is in a disability focused workplace. Okay, meaning in a sheltered workshop, okay, though people might not call it that anymore, but essentially a workplace where everyone has a disability. And they are likely then for sure only earning minimum wage. I don't think they're earning piece rate anymore, although that could still be the case. Okay, so why is it important for us to talk about educational outcomes, employment outcomes, independent living outcomes, when just thinking about some of the students that you're serving, when thinking about those that you might interact with, when thinking about family members, whoever it might be. What is their future? It helps us to understand the true need for support, right? And not just support for themselves, but also for the people that are providing them support. They need support too, because these numbers do not equal self-sufficiency. And that's kind of one of our goals here is to have self-sufficiency, right? So it's just important to keep these things in mind. And this is also kind of maybe that feeling like, how am I ever going to succeed if you know these outcomes? If you don't know someone who has been successful, then who is your role model? And we have a couple role models out there, but some people aren't a fan of those role models, right? So who is it that someone's able to connect to, and are there a lot of people out there? Some, examples: unwritten rules for college, clearly outlined expectations, stereotypes and implications, using inclusive language. Does anybody have something that they think they could do in whatever environment they're in to help that's related to one of these areas that we've been talking about so much? Like, any ideas for the way you present materials, the way you communicate, the way you set up your classroom or your office? What might be some thoughts?
Yeah, I've lately been offering tutoring sessions, like,
Okay.
apart from my just lecture time.
Okay.
It has helped more like a one-on-one, like it's a group session, but it's up to the students if they want to just join by themselves or as a group. So that gives them an additional time with the professor to try to clarify questions, if not just during class time. So
Right.
that has helped.
Absolutely.
And it opens up the time to not just, typical students, but also helps
Right.
open up doors for other students.
Absolutely, absolutely. It creates more inclusion that way. And that could be a way to help overcome if you are feeling like there might be, someone who maybe is taking over office hours a little bit, or asking a lot of questions in the classroom, and you're not able to share what you need to share. Any other thoughts or comments?
Do academic support appointments.
Okay.
So we talk a lot about unwritten rules and
Right.
like steps to do something. How do I set up structure in my week? How, do a lot of talking about these things, and I certainly have fidgets in my office too.
Right, yes. Okay, yeah, and helping someone to identify structure, I mean, that's so beneficial for everyone, right? And especially when you're coming from a more structured environment of high school and now walking into the college setting, that is a struggle. So having some clearly outlined expectations for that can be really beneficial. Thank you for sharing.
So we have a comment on share resources in the syllabus, DSS, counseling, academic success center, writing center, so students are aware of them and the faculty support their use of such resources.
Absolutely. Yeah, resources I think are huge, because sometimes you're not the person that is the best person to go through in those extended office hours or whatever it may be and talk with. Sometimes there is a resource set up on campus that they can be referred to. And outlining that in the beginning could be really beneficial, and also help you to manage your time and all of your responsibilities. One thing I do want to encourage everyone to allow is for people to show up as they are able. So like, I will just talk about myself as an example. I cannot sit during a lecture. I just can't do it. I'm up and moving as much as you see me up and moving here. It is just a part of who I am. I laughed when I was putting together this presentation, I did it on the floor, because that's just how I operate. Okay, so if I'm in a college setting and maybe a virtual setting, you might not see my face all the time, right? That doesn't mean I'm not active. It could mean that I'm just moving around my office, I'm moving around my room, I'm off getting my energy out, whatever it is that I'm doing, and that's okay. Because what we want to make sure is that someone is absorbing the information, they're not so focused on the fact that their legs need to move, right? So we want to allow for that to happen.